This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Hey, you're listening to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Welcome back. If you are a listener, a regular listener, and if you haven't checked us out, we are on YouTube as well under the Police One channel. So check us out. Well, cold case workups are tough nuts to crack. We've seen some advancement since the discovery of the fingerprint, including forensic evidence of blood, hair, other bodily fluids, and of course, DNA. And the leaps in using DNA evidence have taken tremendous stretches over the past decade, especially including genealogy traces from several decades old to quickly obtaining DNA evidence matches in as little as 30 minutes. Well, my guest today is Lindsey Wade, currently a senior law enforcement specialist at RTI International. She served as a Tacoma, Washington police officer for 21 years. And during her 14 years as a detective, she investigated sexual assaults, child abuse, missing person, and homicide cases. Lindsey helped create the Tacoma Police Department's Child Abduction Response Team, the CART, which was the first CART certified by the Department of Justice in the state of Washington in 2013. And since retiring from law enforcement, Lindsey joined the Washington State Attorney General's office as a senior investigator assigned to the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative to pursue her passion using DNA to solve cold cases. Well, welcome to Policing Matters, Lindsey Wade.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. You got a book coming out. We'll talk about that. Do you miss the everyday working cases at the police department, walking in, grabbing that cup of coffee, chatting things up?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things I miss about police work, the camaraderie and, just being able to start a case and go from beginning to end. So I do miss those things. But there are a lot of things about police work I don't really miss, like, the 2 a.m. call outs and, being stuck out at a crime scene for 8 hours at a time in the rain and, freezing your buns off. So there are certain things I don't miss.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. Out in the cold, in the rain, in the dark, no good. But you're in investigations. You've got an array of crimes that you investigated. Certainly, there's that sort of, rush when there's a new case, it's hot, witnesses are available, there's evidence to look at. Now you transition to cold cases, which are kind of the opposite. How was that transition?
Well, it wasn't that difficult for me because I was doing both. When I first started working on cold cases, I think the first cold case I actually kind of volunteered to take was back when I was working sex crimes. And so I still had a full caseload and it was just, something that I was trying to work on the side. And even when I finally became the full-time cold case detective for my agency, I still was on call. So I was still getting called out for the current homicides and the current cases and having to kind of, put my work on hold on the cold cases while I went out and did something on a fresh case and then I'd come back to it. So I never really got that complete separation where I was just 100% focused on cold cases.
Yeah, so you're probably the fifth or sixth person who does cold cases or did them when they were working. And to also, all of you said that you did it in your quote spare time, right? So I think there's this misconception from the public that we have a room full of cops just waiting to, assign stuff to. Why don't you put more cops on it? Send more patrols, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's really different. And it's a shame that people like you with the initiative have to raise their hand and say, "Hey, I'd like to take on more. Can I get this cold case?" In doing so, what was your methodology in picking a case? Did you just what caught your eye?
So there were a few different factors that I would take into consideration when I was looking at a case. So we had when I first, our cold case unit began in 2009, we had about 250 cold cases on the books. And my predecessor had put together a nice spreadsheet with, some basic information about each case. So it was pretty quick reference guide to go back and look at. By the time I took over, I would say most of the cases with the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, had already been resolved. But there were a couple cases, and I think we're going to talk about two of the cases later, that were cases where there was a DNA profile developed of the perpetrator in both of these cases, but there was no match in CODIS. And so while there really wasn't a lot that we could do with the cases, we knew that they were going to be solved eventually with DNA. We just needed a match. So with those cases, there were a lot of proactive things that I chose to do as far as, genealogy, and we used the two cases as sort of, instead of doing a mock child abduction for our annual exercise for our CART team, we chose to use these two cases and it happened to be the 30-year anniversaries of the two cases. And so we basically did a 2-day full-blown exercise with our CART team, and we released new information on the anniversaries about these two cases that had never been released to the public, sort of in place of an Amber Alert, which is what we would see on a current case. So we did a press release and a big press conference, actually, and we opened a tip line, and we had FBI and detectives. We had about 60 people total working on it over 2 days, and it was really cool, and it was really successful, and it was a way for us to get new tips. I think we got about 120 new tips that came in, and we were also able to go out and use all the personnel that we had available to us to go out and collect DNA samples from people that we had on the list to collect voluntary samples from. So, that was kind of a unique exercise, and sort of killing two birds with one stone, right? Like, we had to complete this exercise for the CART certification requirements, but we also were able to get these two cold cases back in front of the public, get the public interest and the media interest, and let people know that we're still working on them. They're not solved.
Yeah. So what a great description of using old school technique with the new DNA breakthroughs. How did you get interested in DNA and genealogy? Was it something introduced to your agency, or did you find it on your own?
Well, DNA in and of itself, I'd been using ever since I became a detective in 2003 on sex crimes cases, and then homicide cases. But genealogy I really learned about in 2015 for the first time, and it was sort of word of mouth, right? Like, you learn when you go to these conferences and you network with other people and you hear about what they're doing. And I actually heard about what Phoenix PD was doing on a cold case that they had just resolved, the Phoenix Canal murders. And I heard that they had used a woman named Colleen Fitzpatrick to help them with the case. And this was like the early days of genealogy. This is 3 years before the Golden State Killer case was solved. And at that time, genealogists were just using YSTR technology, which they could give you a potential last name or surname of the suspect based on their DNA. And so I reached out to her, and she ended up working on these two cases with me, and ultimately provided me with a couple of surnames on both cases, and one of them turned out to be correct in one of the two cases. So it's another tool in the toolbox, and it's not something that you want to stake your whole case on. And now forensic genealogy has evolved to be much more precise, using autosomal DNA, not just YSTR DNA. So it's come a long way, but and it's great. Obviously, there's been over 600 criminal cases solved around the country using forensic genealogy. So, it really has made a huge impact on cold case investigations around the country.
Yeah, for sure. And so, we've got this whole backlog of cases that we can look at when we do have evidence, right? We need the DNA, we need something to go on. But if you did come up with a case, a cold case, and you had DNA that hadn't been processed yet or something that had potential for DNA. What was the processing turnaround like when you wanted to get samples matched? You go to the crime lab and you want them to look at something that's 30 years old, and they look at you like, do you see all this other stuff that I'm processing now? Did you have some sort of relationship, or did you do it through favors, or did you have do you have a dedicated cold case forensic technician?
Yeah, we did not have anyone dedicated, and the way our lab did things is like if the original scientist who did the work on the case was still there, it would go to them, and so it would just be in their queue. So it really was sort of a roll of the dice. But no, we didn't. I mean, I didn't get any special treatment. My cases sat, and so it was just like everybody else's. You had to get in line, and the cases were worked based on the priority level. So even with a couple of the cold cases, I mean, I was sending out, we sent out dozens and dozens of DNA reference samples, and I would have to wait for several months between batches of samples to be tested and then compared to the crime scene evidence, and then I get a report back and send another batch out. So it took a lot of time, and typically I would have multiple cases going at once because I knew that the turnaround time at the lab could be 6 months, 9 months, a year, or longer. And so I would typically have multiple cases where I'd send evidence out to the lab and just sort of put them on the back burner because I knew it was going to take a while for the evidence to be returned. And I would move on to something else while I was waiting.
Yeah, and then of course Murphy's Law, the results all come the same day.
Yeah.
Well, listen, you've had some really interesting cases. I want to ask you about those. But first, I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor, Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com. And we are back, and I'm speaking with Lindsey Wade, Senior Law Enforcement Specialist at RTI International and Cold Case Specialist. You worked extensively on 2 particular cases near the end of your career that were still on the table when you left, really close, but they were almost immediately solved thereafter. Tell us about those.
Yes, these were 2 cold cases that were near and dear to my heart and to many others. Every detective that touched these cases over the years really had, just a place in their hearts for these victims and their families. And, they were never forgotten about. But these were 2 little girls who were murdered in Tacoma back in 1986. And they were murdered about 4.5 months apart. The cases were very similar. The girls were both, blonde, blue-eyed. One was 12, one was 13. They both were out on bikes in local parks. And the parks were not that far from each other. And so the cases were thought to be the work of the same suspect for about 28 years, with good reason. They, everything about the 2 cases, from the abduction to the sexual assault and subsequent murders of these girls, were very similar. And so the cases were worked together for 28 years as if, they had been committed by the same person. And then we got a bombshell revelation. I think it was 2013 maybe, or 2014, we found out that we had 2 different offenders based on DNA testing. And so that really changed the course of the investigations. We had to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate a lot of suspects that had previously been eliminated because they had been eliminated because they were not available for one of the murders. And so now, understanding that we had 2 separate offenders, we had to go back and look at those people again. And so it was a very tedious process. I spent many, many months going through these handwritten reports and typewriter reports and, all these paper files, and entering all of the male names from both case files into a database so that they would be easily searchable. And it allowed me to prioritize these people based on whether or not we had their DNA. And I knew that DNA was going to eventually solve these two cases. And so ultimately, I created a ranking system for these individuals and made a list of people that I wanted to collect DNA samples from, sort of as my high priority group of people. So some of those people we were able to collect from during that 2-day CART exercise I mentioned. And a lot of them we ended up collecting with the help of the FBI, because as you know, these cases were 30 years old at the time. These people have moved, they're all over the country. So we had the FBI collect about 40 samples from people out of state as well. And I think overall we had about 160 DNA reference samples that we collected as a part of this case. And this, like I said, we had every male name in the case file totaled to be about 2,300 names. So it was a very small number of people that we collected from, but that was sort of like my first round, if you will, of DNA collections. Once we got that 160 collected, I started cataloging all the samples and then sending them out in batches to the lab to be tested. And every time I would get a report back from the lab, it would say none of these people match. And so then I'd send the next batch of 20 people out and, wait 5, 6, 7 months. And then I'd get another report back saying none of them match. Finally got to the end, and I had the last 18 samples that I sent out in January of 2018. And at that time, I hadn't planned on retiring, but then I got a job offer at the Attorney General's office. And so I ended up, after a lot of soul searching, deciding that it was time to move on. And so I retired in April of 2018. And 25 days after I retired, a DNA match comes in from that last batch of samples to my suspect in one of the two cases. And he was out of state, so he was someone that the FBI had collected from.
And still alive.
Still alive, yeah. So he was arrested. The cool thing about it was that even though I couldn't be in Illinois to put the handcuffs on him, I was allowed to be the person that made notification to the victim's mother. So I got to show up at her doorstep at whatever it was, 8 in the morning, and give her the news that she'd been waiting for over 30 years by that point. So it was pretty awesome, and by far the best day of my career.
Wow, I bet. So powerful.
Yeah. So that was great. And then the other case, Michelle Welch, her case was solved about a month later with genetic genealogy. And that had been in the works. I had been working with Barbara Ray-Venter, who's a very talented genealogist down in California. And so I had been working with her on the case before I retired, and she was able to come up with potential brothers. I think it was 2 brothers that she was able to provide to the police department as a potential lead. I believe Parabon Nanolabs was also involved, and their genealogist came up with the same 2 brothers. And long story short, they were, one was eliminated and one turned out to be the suspect. He was also still alive and living in Tacoma, and so he was arrested. Both of these men have since been convicted, and they're both currently in prison.
Yeah, so I mean, the chances are that that wasn't their only crime. Could you tell between the initial homicide and then present day, what was the record like? Were there nothing?
So one of the suspects had 0 criminal history. The other one had 2 misdemeanor arrests from the 80s, but nothing sexual, nothing deviant. It was like, criminal trespassing and vehicle prowling or something. I mean, something very low level, nothing that would get your attention. And that individual, his name was Robert Washburn, and he, like I said, he had no criminal history. He was in the case file though, and so he was someone who had called in a tip on the other girl's case. So this is where you kind of get into the bizarre psychology of things. He called in a tip on the other girl's case before he committed the murder,
Wow.
like 3 months before he committed the murder. So that's why he was in the case file in the first place. And as it turned out, he had the same surname that the genealogist, Colleen Fitzpatrick, had given me. So that's why he ended up on my list of people to get DNA from, not because of his past or his, his criminal history.
Yeah. But did that stick out to you when you read the file?
No,
Yeah.
because we didn't
Amazing.
know, I mean, we didn't know, until the case was solved, we didn't know that he was the suspect. So the fact that he called in a tip on the other case, it was like, okay, great.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you, I mean, I'm amazed at the lack of criminal record, but I wonder too if, some of the paraphilia indicators that are low level, like, being a peeping Tom or, um, you know,
Indecent exposure.
yeah, those sort of low level things, you wonder how many times that, that behavior might have been seen and dismissed, or I just wonder if they
Oh,
are, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can discount that type of behavior. And I actually helped to get a law passed in Washington in 2019, and it's called Jennifer and Michelle's Law, and it expanded the DNA law in Washington. And one of the things that it did was it added the crime of indecent exposure to the list of crimes that require a DNA sample to be collected at the time of conviction, because it's clear from the data that, I mean, if you go and look at the histories, just the self-reported histories of, take the population of civilly committed sex offenders, they will tell you that they engaged in a lot of indecent exposure activity, exposing themselves to people and, to women, to kids, to whoever. And this went on for a lot of them, it went on in between the contact sex offenses, so it wasn't like they just started with that and then didn't do it anymore. Sometimes they did it continuously. So I think it's not a crime to be just scoffed at or laughed at or, brushed off. It's something that it should be taken seriously.
Yeah, for sure. And the line's been blurred with societal changes over the last 20 years. What used to be extremely taboo is somewhat accepted on different levels.
Mhm.
In these two cases, what was your involvement like post identification? Once these two were arrested, were you then recalled during the court cases to testify about your investigative techniques?
So luckily, neither of these cases went to trial, so I did not have to testify. I was involved with some of the meetings that took place in the prosecutor's office with the victim's family and discussing, potential plea agreements or, things of that nature in one of the cases. And then I attended, the court hearings, of course, but, I didn't have to testify in either case because there was no trial.
Yeah, I was going to follow up. I talked with another cold case investigator a while back about, the exculpatory evidence that we give during court hearings. And I wonder if we just give away too much of our investigative secrecy so that we're able to use it again and catch some of these predators, either online predators or, these sexual deviants that when we talk about our investigative techniques and using digital forensics in tracking them.
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't think that there's any way around it, to be honest. And while these criminals, they probably do gain a lot of insight and knowledge by reading the search warrant affidavits and listening to testimony and things like that. At the end of the day, they're not actually that smart. So, I'm just going to give you a case in point. I had a serial rapist who thought he was educated enough to eliminate his DNA from the crime scenes, so he would actually make the victims bathe in order to eliminate his DNA. But he was not bright enough to understand that if you leave the toothbrush that you made the victim brush their teeth with in the shower, then your DNA is still there just because it's not physically on her body anymore. It's still on the towel, it's still potentially in the tub, and it's still on that piece of evidence. So they're not quite that smart. They make the victim bathe, but they leave cigarette butts and they drink out of, orange juice containers at the crime scene and leave those there. So while they kind of think they know what they're doing, they really don't.
Yeah, real genius. Yeah, we had a particularly heinous homicide, multiple victims in San Francisco, and the suspect took every cleaner he could find, shampoo, Clorox, under the sinks, in cupboards, poured it throughout the house, thinking that he was going to spoil any kind of DNA evidence. Of course,
Right.
it didn't work.
Yeah. I mean, I've had several, especially sexual assault cases, where the offender tries to eliminate their DNA and all they do is just make a big mess, but their DNA is still there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, what are you doing these days? Are you still on the hook for some of these cold cases, or are you running off with some new ones?
No, I luckily I don't think I have anything outstanding. You never know with criminal trials, though things come back and whatnot. But so far, I haven't had anything recently. So currently, I'm really just focusing on my role at RTI. As kind of a subject matter expert and law enforcement liaison. And then in my personal time, just getting out there and trying to promote my new book, which is a collection of cases that I investigated over the years, including those two from 1986 that I talk about extensively in the book. And then I'm also working on a new podcast, actually. So hoping that will get some legs and be available for listeners here in the near future.
Yep. I mean, I don't know anyone who listens to just one podcast. There's some good ones out there, and yeah, I wish you success there. Can't wait to hear one of them. Well, thanks for taking time with us today. Wish you good luck on the book, and we will have a link in our show notes for our listeners and watchers to take a look at. And thanks for being on the show today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Hey, to our listeners, let me know what you think about cold cases and the DNA innovations and what's happening near you. Drop me a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. That's policingmatters@policeone.com. Thanks for listening. Take good care, be safe, and hope to talk to you again real soon.